Imagine you lend your neighbor money. He can't pay it back. You give him more time. He still can't pay. You restructure the loan. He promises to pay. And then he doesn't. Now imagine that neighbor is an entire country. And this has happened 9 times. Not twice, not 3 times, 9. Argentina holds a record no country wants. The most sovereign debt defaults in modern history. And the truly disturbing part, every single time, economists said it wouldn't happen again. Every time there were new plans, new promises, new numbers that made the debt look manageable. Every time, they were wrong. This isn't a story about incompetence. It's a story about a financial trap so deep, so structural, so embedded in Argentina's economy. That default isn't an accident. It's almost inevitable. Stay with me. Because what happened to Argentina is a warning that goes far beyond South America. To understand why Argentina keeps defaulting, you need to go back to the 1970s. Not to Argentina, but to New York. The 1970s were a decade of crisis for the global economy. The U.S. had just abandoned the gold standard. Oil prices exploded. Inflation was ravaging the developed world. And American banks, sitting on enormous piles of petrodollars from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, needed somewhere to put that money. They found it in Latin America. Argentina, like most of its neighbors, was a willing borrower. The country had real assets, fertile land, educated people, natural resources. International lenders looked at Argentina and saw potential. They saw a country that should be rich. So the loans flowed in, billions of dollars, at interest rates that seemed reasonable at the time. But here's the problem that nobody wanted to talk about. Argentina wasn't borrowing to build. It was borrowing to consume, to fund government spending, to subsidize industries, to maintain a military dictatorship that needed money to stay in power. And when Paul Volcker at the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates to 20% in 1981 to fight American inflation, those dollar-denominated loans suddenly became catastrophically expensive. Argentina's debt didn't just grow, it exploded. By 1982, Argentina couldn't service its debt. The first modern default was coming. But rather than restructure honestly, rather than admit the scale of the problem, Argentina did what indebted governments almost always do. It borrowed more. It kicked the can. It kept the illusion alive a little longer. That decision, made in 1982, would haunt Argentina for the next 4 decades. Here's the pattern that repeats across all 9 defaults. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Step 1. Argentina needs money. It borrows in dollars because international lenders don't trust the Argentine peso. This seems logical. Dollars are stable, dollars are trusted. Step 2. Argentina spends. Sometimes productively, often not. Governments change, policies change, but the dollar debt remains. Step 3. The economy slows, tax revenues fall short, the peso weakens, but the debt is in dollars. So every time the peso loses value, the real burden of the debt gets heavier. Step 4. Argentina tries to maintain the peg, either to gold, to the dollar, or to some fixed exchange rate, to convince markets that the peso is stable. This requires burning through foreign reserves. Step 5. The reserves run out. The peg collapses, the peso crashes, and the dollar debt, which hasn't changed in nominal terms, is now an impossible burden. Step 6. Default. This cycle played out in 1982, in 1989, 2001, and 2014. In 2020, each time with different packaging, each time with different political actors, each time reaching the same destination. The 2001 crisis was the most dramatic. Argentina had pegged its peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar throughout the 1990s, a policy called the convertibility plan. For a decade, it worked. Inflation dropped. Foreign investment came in. Argentina was held up by the IMF as a model for emerging markets. Then the US dollar strengthened in the late 1990s. Because the peso was locked to the dollar, Argentine exports became too expensive. The economy contracted, tax revenues fell. Argentina borrowed more to cover the gap. By December 2001, the government froze bank accounts to prevent a run. Argentines couldn't access their own savings. The country erupted. 5 presidents in 10 days. And then, a default on $100 billion of debt. The largest sovereign default in history at that point. People were banging pots outside banks. Middle-class families lined up at soup kitchens. Unemployment hit 25%. And yet, within 3 years, Argentina was borrowing again. This is the question that makes economists uncomfortable. Because the answer isn't just about Argentina. First, the structural dollar trap. Argentina earns its foreign currency primarily through agricultural exports, soybeans, corn, beef. But most government spending, most wages, most economic activity is in pesos. So when global commodity prices fall, or when the peso weakens, the government's dollar income shrinks, while its peso obligations stay the same. This mismatch is the core of the trap, and it can't be solved by a single government in a single term. Second, political time horizons. Every Argentine government faces the same choice: implement painful austerity now, or borrow and delay the pain. Austerity is politically lethal. Borrowing buys time. So governments borrow. The people who make that decision are not the same people who will manage the consequences. The incentives are completely misaligned. Third, the IMF problem. The International Monetary Fund has lent Argentina more money than almost any country in history. In 2018, a $57 billion bailout, the largest in IMF history at that time. The stated goal was to stabilize the economy. The actual result was to add more dollar debt to a country already drowning in it. Critics argue the IMF's involvement has historically extended Argentina's cycle, rather than breaking it. Every bailout comes with conditions: austerity, structural reforms, that are politically impossible to sustain. They get implemented halfway, the economy contracts, and the next election brings in a government that reverses course. The cycle continues. The debt compounds. Fourth, and this is the one nobody wants to say out loud, some creditors benefit from the cycle. Vulture funds, hedge funds that buy distressed sovereign debt at a fraction of face value, have made billions from Argentina's defaults. In 2016, Argentina paid $9.3 billion to settle with holdout creditors, funds that had bought defaulted bonds for cents on the dollar and refused every restructuring offer for 15 years. These funds didn't cause Argentina's problems, but they understood the system well enough to profit from them. The system was designed, or at least evolved, to serve creditors more reliably than debtors. In 2020, Argentina defaulted for the 9th time. By 2024, inflation had exceeded 200% annually. The new government of Javier Milei launched radical austerity, cutting government spending, eliminating subsidies, dollarizing large parts of the economy. This time, they said, is different. You've heard that before. The structural problems haven't disappeared. Argentina still has dollar-denominated debt. It still depends on commodity exports for its foreign currency. It still has a history of reversing painful reforms when the political cost becomes too high. And here's the hard truth about sovereign debt cycles. They don't break because a government wants them to. They break when the underlying structure of the economy fundamentally changes, when exports diversify, when institutions become strong enough to survive political transitions, when the mismatch between dollar debts and peso revenues is finally resolved. That takes decades, not one presidential term. Argentina is an extreme case, but it's not a unique one. The same basic dynamic, dollar debt, weak currency, political short-termism, creditor incentives, exists in dozens of countries today. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022, Lebanon in 2020, Zambia in 2020. Pakistan has been on the edge for years. The lesson of Argentina isn't that its leaders were uniquely corrupt or uniquely incompetent. The lesson is that financial systems, once trapped, are extraordinarily difficult to escape, and that the same architecture that allows poor countries to borrow is also the architecture that keeps them indebted. Understanding that architecture, who builds it, who benefits from it, and who pays the price, is the beginning of understanding how the global economy actually works. Not the textbook version, the real one. If this kind of financial history is what you're here for, subscribe, because we're just getting started.